Hello, everybody, and welcome to this podcast episode with your host, Ethan Cetton. Now, I am a rural educator and a graduate student at Houghton University. I'm currently a full-time substitute teacher in the area while I am doing graduate courses in the education department. Now, this podcast episode is going to be focused on a specific area in the teaching in rural education. During this podcast, we're going to be hearing some interviews from some other rural educators, and we'll be diving into some research. And when we look at rural education, we see a lot of positives, we see a lot of negatives, but we also see some issues that can get sorted out. Today's podcast episode is going to be specifically diving into the problem of teachers feeling isolated sometimes when they are rural educators. More specifically, new rural educators coming from bigger areas into the smaller environments in a rural setting. Our focus question today will be: a rural educator desires to develop a sense of community to better able to teach in a culturally responsive environment for his/their rural educators, but he grew up outside of that rural community. We're going to be breaking this question down into two specific parts to tackle how we can solve this issue. How can a rural educator develop relationships with their students in the community, and how can a rural educator develop relationships with her coworkers in a rural community? When we tie these two questions together, we're going to find some answers how these teachers can develop a sense of belonging and a sense of unity within their communities. Thank you for joining us in today's podcast. We're really excited to have you. The first question we're going to be tackling in this podcast is: how can rural educators develop relationships with coworkers/other teachers? Sometimes when teachers feel isolated in a new setting, whether that's rural or in an urban setting, they can feel like they're alone in their teaching experience. Having teachers develop meaningful and deep relationships with their coworkers can help them feel united and cohesive during their teaching experience. The first interview that we will listen to from Rory Flynn, a rural educator from Massachusetts, will speak on her experience going into her new job in a rural district and how she developed relationships and how those meaningful relationships with other teachers has helped her so far in her teaching experience.
All right, Rory, you've had the experience of growing up in a rural setting, and now you're on the other side. You're a teacher, and a problem that we've seen with rural educators, not just young rural educators, but educators at all ages, is the isolation feeling that sometimes they have. And it's hard to develop relationships when you're in such a small community at times. But on the other hand, you can develop relationships with your peers if you do the right things. Talk to me about your experience as a young educator and how you've developed relationships with your peers around you and your coworkers.
Yeah, I will say it's been a little bit difficult just because I'm the only fifth grade teacher in the building. There's no other fifth grade teachers, and we don't co-teach anything. So I don't really have anyone that I can collaborate with in that sense. But I do have a mentor teacher, and she used to be the fifth grade teacher for about 20 years, and now she's a math interventionist. And our rooms connect, so we talk a lot, and she gives me a lot of insight, and so it's been good to have that relationship. The other thing that has been really great for me is there are 4 brand new teachers in the building this year, so we're all the same age, and one of them is the 6th grade teacher, and another one is a 4th grade teacher. And so we are able to talk and collaborate a lot because we're all new. We're new to teaching, we're new to the building, but we're close in grade levels. So we're able to talk a lot. I collaborate a lot with the 6th grade teacher because we're across the hall from each other. And I know that she is potentially going to have my students next year. So we talk about a lot about how the things that I'm doing are going towards what she's doing with her students. So that's been really great. My district also has a program for all new teachers in the district where we come together once a month and we meet with all of the teachers, the mentor teachers and the new teachers, and we kind of talk about different things that we're struggling with or things that are going well so we can kind of have our questions answered.
It was great hearing from Miss Flynn from that interview and how she overcame and took the initiative to develop those relationships with her other teachers and how that has benefited her in her teaching experience so far. Another way, building off that idea that teachers can develop further relationships, is through the article Overcoming the Isolation of Rural Teachers from Michelle Blanchett and Darcy Beckegaard. And the way they can do this is actually through virtual learning, something in our 21st century that we see. And it's through building PLCs, professional learning communities, online. There are many websites and platforms that teachers can reach out to other teachers from around the world and bounce ideas off of each other and help guide them almost as a therapy type deal with experienced teachers through their early stages of teaching. Moving on to our next question that we're going to be tackling in this podcast, which is overall, I think that one of the most important things any teacher can do in any scenario is developing relationships with their students. Many teachers go through the motions and they show up and they're present in the classroom, but they don't have those relationships with their students and they don't have the understanding and that step of understanding how their students learn and understanding who their students are. One of the biggest things that I've learned in my teaching experience around Houghton and also in my classes in the education department at Houghton is the students make up the classroom. Every classroom in the world has the same thing when it comes to students. They're filled with many kids who are different in all different areas outside of school and in school. Knowing how these students learn, think, and what hobbies they have is super important for teachers if they want to build a classroom that's filled with dialogue and filled with joy and students that are excited to learn every single day. One of the other interviews that we'll have on this podcast is from Lukas Cornell, my teammate here on the baseball team at Houghton, but also someone who's in his early stages of rural education, a practicum student at Houghton University. He is currently a rural educator in the practicum setting at a local rural school, and you'll hear how he has learned how to develop further relationships with his students.
Talk to me about how you build relationships in your practicum setting in the classroom with students specifically as a young male teacher.
Yeah, so the trend you see now, and especially in rural areas, is the absence of a father figure or even that older brother figure. So you can definitely tell what students have a father or older brother figure in their life because they're not as attached to me as other students would be. So I feel like gaining those relationships with all the students, in my opinion, it's really easy because I'm younger. I can connect to a lot of the students. I'm in third grade right now, so a lot of them are up to date with all the trends and stuff like that. So I can kind of relate to them in a sense. And when it comes to learning, it's really simple to keep them engaged through stuff that they enjoy because you can, in the rural areas, they all do the same stuff. Like there's 19 kids in my third grade class at Friendship, and all 19 of them play basketball. So when it comes to educating, I think integrating something like basketball, or even a lot of them play baseball as well for the town. So doing something that interests them in the classroom allows them to be closer to me as well because they recognize that, hey, like he also grew up on the same kind of stuff, so I relate to that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Cornell, for doing that interview, and thank you to Miss Flynn earlier for doing her interview. As you can see, relationships with teachers and relationships with students can extend outside the classroom into the community and is super important inside the classroom as well. When we take the initiative as teachers, we can negate that isolated feeling as rural educators when we engage with the people around us. Thank you for tuning in to this podcast episode. I'm your host, Ethan Cetton, and we have found a way to feel less isolated as teachers when we extend our open arms into the community with developing relationships with our teachers, when developing cohesive relationships with our mentors, and also understanding our students so we can have a classroom that's filled with dialogue and a classroom that's filled with personability. Thank you for joining us on this Rural Education Podcast.